The morning air was crisp and cool as Ethan Taylor adjusted the straps of his leather pack, the weight of his rifle pressing against his shoulder. The tall pines around him swayed gently in the wind, their dark green needles casting long shadows over the narrow trail. In front of him, a group of 6 men trudged forward, each carrying their own gear, faces hardened by years of experience in the wild. Among them was John Reynolds, their leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a permanent frown etched into his weathered face. He walked with purpose, his sharp blue eyes scanning the trees ahead for any signs of movement. Ethan had heard of John before, a man known for his tough leadership and no-nonsense attitude. He was the type of man who valued results over excuses, and Ethan knew this journey would push him to his limits. But he had no choice. He needed the money. His wife Mary and their young son Samuel were counting on him to return with enough earnings to get them through the long winter ahead. The thought of them kept his legs moving, even as the cold air bit into his skin. "Keep up, Taylor," John's voice cut through the wind. "We don't have all day." Ethan quickened his pace, nodding without a word. He wasn't one to complain, even though his muscles already ached from days of walking. The forest seemed endless, with nothing but towering trees and rugged terrain in every direction. They had been traveling for nearly a week, searching for a remote valley rumored to be rich in game, deer, elk, and the occasional bear whose fur could fetch a high price back in town. The men said little as they walked, their breath visible in the frigid air. Most of them were seasoned hunters like Ethan, though some were newer to the trade. Lucas, a wiry man with a constant smirk, walked near the back, muttering jokes to anyone who would listen. Henry, a large, quiet man, kept his eyes on the ground, lost in thought. The others were just as focused, knowing that a successful hunt could mean survival, while failure could leave them all broke and hungry. As they pressed deeper into the wilderness, the landscape grew harsher. The ground beneath their feet turned from soft soil to jagged rocks and uneven paths. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees, bringing with it the unmistakable scent of pine and damp earth. Occasionally, the call of a distant bird would echo through the woods, reminding them that they were not alone in this vast, untamed land. Ethan took a deep breath, his lungs filling with the cold, fresh air. He had always loved the outdoors, the sense of freedom that came with being surrounded by nature. But this journey was different. It wasn't just about the thrill of the hunt. It was about survival. Every step they took brought them closer to their goal, but it also brought them deeper into danger. Wild animals roamed these woods, and the weather could turn without warning. A single mistake could mean disaster. John paused at the edge of a small clearing, raising a hand to signal the group to stop. Ethan squatted down, resting his pack on the ground as he scanned the area. The clearing was quiet, the only sound being the rustle of leaves in the wind. John surveyed the area carefully before speaking in his low, gruff voice. "We'll make camp here for the night," he said, his eyes still sweeping the tree line. "Get a fire going. We need to keep warm." Ethan nodded and began gathering dry branches, his hands cold but steady. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting the forest in a pale orange light. The temperature would drop quickly once night fell, and they needed all the warmth they could get. As the fire crackled to life, the men gathered around it, the heat a welcome relief from the biting cold. Ethan sat quietly watching the flames dance, his thoughts drifting to home. He could picture Mary's face, her gentle smile, and the way she would hum softly to Samuel as she rocked him to sleep. He missed them both terribly, but he knew he had to stay strong. This journey was for them. "Long way from home, aren't we?" Lucas said, sitting down next to Ethan. His voice was casual, but there was a hint of mockery in it. "Yeah," Ethan replied, not taking the bait. He knew Lucas liked to stir trouble, but he wasn't in the mood. Lucas chuckled, poking at the fire with a stick. "Well, I hope you're ready for what's coming. This place gets rough, and not everyone makes it out in one piece." Ethan glanced at him, his jaw tightening. He knew Lucas was trying to mess with his head, but he refused to show any fear. "I've seen rough before," he said simply. Before Lucas could respond, John stood up, his presence commanding the attention of the group. "Get some rest," he ordered. "Tomorrow we head deeper into the valley. We'll need all the strength we can get." The men nodded and began settling down for the night, laying out their bedrolls around the fire. Ethan lay on his back, staring up at the darkening sky. The stars were just starting to peek through the clouds, twinkling like tiny beacons of hope in the vast darkness. As he closed his eyes, Ethan knew that the real challenges were just beginning. The wilderness was unforgiving, and survival would require every ounce of skill and determination he had. But he was ready. He had to be. For Mary, for Samuel, for survival. The forest was silent, save for the soft crunch of Ethan's boots on the frosted ground. He moved carefully, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands, eyes scanning the dense underbrush for any sign of movement. The early morning mist clung to the trees, wrapping the landscape in a ghostly haze. It was Ethan's turn to hunt alone today. The others had spread out in different directions, each trying their luck in the untamed wilderness. Ethan had tracked the faint prints of a large elk through the woods, following them deep into unfamiliar territory. His instincts told him he was close. The prints were fresh and the wind was in his favor. As he crouched low to the ground, carefully avoiding the crunch of fallen branches, his heart raced with the thrill of the hunt. He needed this. The pelt from an elk could fetch enough to keep his family comfortable for the winter. Suddenly a sound broke the silence, a rustling in the bushes up ahead. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat. His pulse quickened as he slowly raised his rifle, eyes locked on the movement ahead. He could see a flash of brown fur through the trees. The elk? He inched forward, careful not to make any noise, his finger ready on the trigger. But then something shifted in the air. A low growl, deep and guttural, echoed through the woods. Ethan's blood ran cold. This wasn't an elk. He took a cautious step back, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The growl grew louder, more menacing. Without warning, the bushes ahead exploded in a flurry of movement, and a massive brown bear charged toward him, its eyes wild with fury. Ethan barely had time to react. He fired his rifle, but the shot went wide, echoing uselessly through the trees. The bear was on him in seconds. Ethan tried to dodge, but the bear's paw swiped across his chest with terrifying force, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain erupted in his body as he felt the sharp claws tear through his jacket and into his flesh. Gasping for air, he scrambled backward, trying to put distance between him and the massive creature. But the bear wasn't finished. It roared, a thunderous sound that shook the forest, and lunged at him again. Ethan barely managed to roll to the side, but not before the bear's weight crashed down on him, pinning his leg. He screamed in agony, his hands clawing at the dirt as he struggled to free himself. The bear's hot breath was on his neck, its teeth bared as it prepared to strike again. Desperation surged through Ethan. In a final, frantic move, he reached for his hunting knife, pulling it from his belt and driving it into the bear's side. The beast let out an ear-splitting roar of pain and staggered back, blood dripping from its side. It swayed for a moment before retreating into the woods, disappearing into the thick trees as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan lay on the ground gasping for breath, his body racked with pain. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he might lose consciousness. His chest burned where the bear had clawed him, and his leg throbbed where it had been crushed beneath the bear's weight. He tried to move, but his body refused to cooperate. He was too weak, too broken. The minutes passed slowly, the forest around him eerily quiet once more. Ethan knew he needed help, but the others were too far away. He was alone. Hours later, John and the rest of the group found him. The sight of Ethan's battered body lying motionless on the forest floor sent a wave of shock through the men. John crouched beside him, his face grim as he examined the wounds. Blood soaked Ethan's jacket and his breathing was shallow, but he was still alive. "He's in bad shape," John muttered, standing up and turning to the group. "Real bad." Lucas, standing at the back of the group, crossed his arms and shrugged. "Looks like he's done for. No way he's surviving that." John's face tightened. He knew the truth of it. Ethan's injuries were severe. The cold would only make things worse. Carrying him back through the rough terrain could slow them all down. And in these conditions, every delay was dangerous. The decision weighed heavily on him. Henry stepped forward, his eyes full of concern. "We can't just leave him here, John. There's got to be something we can do." John shook his head, his voice hard. "We're too far out. Even if we tried to carry him, it could take days to get back. And we don't have the supplies for that. The best we can do is make him comfortable. Maybe he'll pull through." Henry looked like he wanted to argue, but John's expression made it clear that the decision was final. "Lucas, Henry," John continued, his tone commanding. "You two stay with him. Keep him warm, give him water. We'll leave some supplies. If he makes it through the night, we'll come back for him." Lucas groaned, clearly unhappy with the task. "This is a waste of time, John. We all know he's not going to make it." "Do as I say," John snapped, silencing any further protest. The group left quickly, their footsteps fading into the distance as John led the others back to camp. Lucas and Henry remained behind, setting up a small fire and laying Ethan down beside it. The firelight flickered over Ethan's pale face, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. After a while, Lucas sat down on a nearby log, staring at Ethan's motionless form. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "We're just sitting here waiting for him to die." Henry looked at him sharply. "Show some respect, Lucas. He's still one of us," Lucas scoffed. "Yeah, well, I don't plan on freezing to death out here, waiting for a man who's already half dead." He stood up, his eyes scanning the darkening forest. "We should leave. If he's still alive in the morning, someone else can come back for him, but I'm not sticking around here for this." Henry hesitated, torn between his loyalty to Ethan and his fear of the wilderness. But in the end, Lucas's words got to him. The danger of staying in the cold, isolated from the group, was too much. With a guilty glance at Ethan, Henry slowly nodded. "All right, let's go." Without another word, the two men packed up what little gear they had and disappeared into the woods, leaving Ethan alone in the flickering firelight, his life hanging by a thread. The first thing Ethan became aware of was the cold. It gnawed at his bones, creeping through his torn jacket and into his very core. His eyes fluttered open, vision hazy, the world around him a blur of dark trees and fading firelight. For a moment he lay still, too weak to even lift his head. Every inch of his body screamed in pain. His chest burned where the bear's claws had raked across him, and his leg throbbed with a deep, relentless ache. He blinked, trying to focus. The fire that Lucas and Henry had made was now little more than glowing embers, casting faint shadows around the small clearing. But there was no sign of the two men. Ethan's heart sank. He was alone. He tried to call out, his voice a raspy whisper that barely carried beyond his lips. "Lucas." "Henry." Nothing. The forest around him was silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Panic began to rise in his chest. They had left him to die. For a moment, despair threatened to overtake him. His body was broken, his strength drained. He could feel the weight of his injuries pulling him down, the darkness of the wilderness closing in. But then, through the fog of pain and exhaustion, a single thought broke through. Mary, Samuel, his family. The faces of his wife and son flashed in his mind, clear and vivid. He couldn't leave them. He wouldn't leave them. Ethan clenched his teeth, forcing himself to breathe through the pain. He couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. With a groan of effort, Ethan pushed himself up onto his elbows. His chest screamed in protest, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the task at hand. He had to move. Staying here would mean death, either from the cold or from another animal attack. He had to find shelter, had to find food. Slowly, painfully, he began to crawl. The forest floor was rough and uneven, the cold dirt scraping against his hands as he dragged himself forward. Every movement sent jolts of pain through his body, but Ethan gritted his teeth and pushed through it. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one burning in his throat. The sun was high overhead now, casting long shadows between the trees, but its warmth did little to ease the chill in his bones. As he crawled, Ethan scanned the surrounding area for anything that might help him. The forest was dense with tall pines, their needles littering the ground beneath him. In the distance, he could hear the faint trickle of a stream. Water, at least, wouldn't be a problem. But food was another matter entirely. He had no weapon, no supplies. All he had was the small hunting knife still strapped to his belt. Hours passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Ethan's body screamed for rest, but he refused to stop. Every time he felt like giving up, he thought of Mary's smile, of Samuel's laughter. They were his lifeline, his anchor. He had to keep going. He had to. Eventually, as the light began to fade and the shadows grew longer, Ethan spotted a small rocky outcrop up ahead. It wasn't much, but it would provide some shelter for the night. Gritting his teeth, he pushed himself toward it, his arms trembling with the effort. By the time he reached the outcrop, his entire body was shaking with exhaustion. He collapsed against the rocks, gasping for breath. His hands were scraped and bloodied, his muscles screaming in protest. But he had made it. For now, he was safe. Ethan pulled his coat tighter around him, trying to conserve what little warmth he had. The temperature was dropping fast, and he knew the cold would be his biggest enemy tonight. He had no fire, no way to keep warm. All he could do was huddle beneath the rocky overhang, using the earth as a shield against the biting wind. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds. Distant howls, the rustling of animals in the underbrush. Ethan's mind raced with the possibilities of what could be lurking out there, waiting for a moment of weakness. But there was no time for fear. He had to rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and he needed whatever strength he could muster. Sleep was fitful, broken by the sharp pain in his chest and leg. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and he drifted into a restless slumber. The next morning, Ethan woke with the first light of dawn, his body stiff and aching. The cold had numbed his hands and feet, and his wounds throbbed with every movement. But he was alive. That, at least, was something. He sat up slowly, wincing as the pain shot through him. His breath came in shallow gasps, but he forced himself to take stock of his situation. He needed food. Without it, his strength would fail, and the wilderness would claim him. Ethan looked around, searching for any signs of wildlife. He had no rifle, no bow, just his knife. But he had been a hunter all his life, and he knew how to track animals. Slowly, he began crawling through the forest again, using every ounce of his remaining energy to scan for tracks or signs of small game. Hours passed, and his search seemed fruitless. But just as he was about to lose hope, he spotted something. A small rabbit, its ears twitching as it foraged among the underbrush. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Ethan's heart pounded as he reached for his knife, moving as quietly as his injuries would allow. The rabbit was quick, but Ethan was desperate. With a final burst of energy, he lunged forward, throwing his knife with precision. The blade hit its mark, and the rabbit fell. Relief flooded through him as he retrieved the animal. It wasn't a feast, but it was enough to keep him going for another day. Using a few dry twigs and leaves he had collected along the way, Ethan managed to start a small fire, cooking the meat and savoring every bite. It was a small victory, but in the wilderness, every victory counted. Days turned into weeks, each one blending into the next as Ethan fought to survive. He scavenged what he could from the forest, roots, berries, small game, and slowly, bit by bit, his strength began to return. His wounds, though still painful, started to heal, the deep cuts scarring over. The cold remained a constant threat, but Ethan had learned to adapt, using the landscape to his advantage, finding shelter where he could. Through it all, the thought of his family kept him going. Every day was a battle, but it was a battle he refused to lose. His body was battered, his spirit tested, but Ethan Taylor was not a man who gave up easily. He was going to make it out of the wild, no matter what it took. The chill of the early morning air seeped into Ethan's bones as he stood at the edge of the dense forest, his breath visible in the pale dawn light. His body, still covered in scars and bruises, had grown stronger over the past weeks. The constant pain had dulled into an ache, and though the limp in his leg remained, he could now walk without collapsing in exhaustion after a few steps. His survival had been a hard-fought battle against the wilderness, but now, as the sun began to rise over the horizon, Ethan's mind was focused on a different battle, one driven by betrayal. The image of Lucas and Henry abandoning him haunted his every step. In the dead of night, he had woken to find them gone, their footsteps leading away from his prone body, leaving him for dead. Ethan clenched his fists, anger and hurt surging through him. They hadn't just abandoned him, they had made a choice to leave him to die in the wild. And now, as his strength returned, so did his desire for justice. "I'll find them," he thought, his jaw tight. "They need to answer for what they did." But first, he needed to make it back to the settlement. It would be a long, grueling journey. But Ethan had survived worse. He had faced death and lived to tell the tale. Now it was time to face those who had wronged him. With a determined gaze, Ethan adjusted his pack, now filled with the minimal supplies he had scavenged from the forest, and began his trek back. The journey would take him through some of the harshest parts of the wilderness, but nothing could deter him now. The first few days were marked by an unsettling calm. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, and the silence was punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the call of distant birds. The path was unforgiving. Rocky hills, thick undergrowth, and fallen trees made every step a challenge. Ethan's injured leg ached with every climb, but he pushed on, his focus unwavering. By the third day, the terrain began to change. The thick trees gave way to rolling hills and jagged cliffs. It was here that Ethan encountered his first major obstacle, a wide, treacherous river cutting through the land. The water surged with a fierce current, its surface gleaming like a sheet of icy glass. Ethan stood at the edge, eyeing the dangerous flow. He had no choice but to cross. He searched for a way to ford the river, his eyes scanning for anything that might serve as a bridge. Further downstream, he spotted a cluster of large boulders, forming a jagged path across the water. It was risky. The rocks were slick with ice, and one wrong step could send him tumbling into the freezing waters below. But it was his only option. With careful, deliberate movements, Ethan began his crossing. His boots slipped on the wet rocks, and his heart raced with every precarious step. The roar of the river was deafening, and the cold spray of water stung his face. Halfway across, one of his feet slipped, and he nearly lost his balance. For a moment, he teetered on the edge, his arms flailing as he fought to stay upright. His heart pounded in his chest, but with a sharp inhale, he regained his footing, narrowly avoiding a plunge into the river. It felt like hours had passed by the time he reached the other side, his body drenched in sweat despite the cold. But he had made it. Ethan paused for a moment to catch his breath, his legs trembling from the effort. The river behind him raged on, but he pressed forward, determined to cover as much ground as possible before nightfall. A few days later, the weather began to turn. Dark clouds gathered overhead, and the once clear sky became a churning mass of gray. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and soon snow began to fall, first in small, delicate flakes, then in heavy, blinding sheets. Ethan pulled his coat tighter around him, his face numb from the biting wind. The snowstorm came without mercy. The visibility dropped to almost nothing, the landscape becoming a swirling white void. Each step was a struggle as the snow piled up around him, reaching past his ankles and slowing his pace to a crawl. But Ethan kept moving, his mind focused on one thing, making it back. He couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. The betrayal burned in his chest, fueling his every movement. At night, Ethan found shelter wherever he could, under rocky overhangs or in the hollowed-out trunks of trees. He built small fires, using the dry kindling he had carefully saved, and rationed the small amounts of food he had hunted. The wilderness had taught him how to survive, but the storm tested even his strongest instincts. On the 5th day of the storm, as the snow continued to fall relentlessly, Ethan began to falter. His body, though stronger than before, was still weakened from his injuries. His legs felt like lead, each step more difficult than the last. His hands, despite being gloved, were numb from the cold, and his vision blurred from exhaustion. But through it all, he refused to give up. The memory of Lucas and Henry abandoning him played over and over in his mind, a constant reminder of why he had to keep going. It wasn't until the 10th day of his journey that Ethan finally saw the first signs of civilization. In the distance, through the thinning snow, he spotted the faint outline of a wooden cabin, its roof covered in a thick blanket of white. His heart leaped in his chest. He was close, closer than he had ever been. With renewed energy, Ethan pressed forward, his body protesting with every step, but his mind too focused to care. As he neared the settlement, the cabins grew more numerous, and soon the sight of smoke rising from chimneys filled the air. It was a small outpost, the kind where fur traders and trappers gathered before returning to the larger towns. Ethan stumbled into the clearing, his legs shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold air filled his lungs as he stood there, surveying the place he had once considered his temporary home. He was back, and Lucas and Henry were somewhere in this settlement. He made his way toward the central cabin, where John Reynolds and the rest of the group would likely be gathered. His heart raced as he thought of the confrontation to come, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. They had left him for dead. Now it was time for them to face the consequences. As he reached the cabin door, Ethan paused, his hand hovering over the handle. The journey had been long, and the cost had been high, but now, standing on the threshold, he knew he had made it. He had survived. Now it was time to seek justice. The warmth of the cabin hit Ethan like a wave as he stepped inside. After days of battling snowstorms and freezing winds, the heat from the crackling fire was almost too much to bear. His limbs felt stiff, his breath still labored from the long journey. But the sight of familiar faces around the room brought a surge of emotions to the surface. Anger, betrayal, and a deep, unshakable need for justice. The cabin was small, but packed with men. Some sat at wooden tables, cleaning their rifles or mending their gear, while others stood near the fire, talking in low voices. It didn't take long for them to notice Ethan's entrance. One by one, the conversation stopped, and heads turned in his direction. The air grew tense as the room fell into a stunned silence. Ethan's eyes, tired but burning with purpose, scanned the faces until they locked onto two familiar ones, Lucas and Henry. Lucas was sitting near the back of the room, leaning against the wall with his usual smug expression, while Henry stood by the fire, his hands gripping a cup of coffee. For a moment, neither man seemed to fully register Ethan's presence, but when they did, the color drained from their faces. "Ethan?" Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. Ethan took a slow, deliberate step forward, his limp still evident, but his presence commanding. His eyes bore into Lucas and Henry, the two men who had left him to die in the cold, brutal wilderness. The anger he had suppressed for so long bubbled to the surface, but he kept his voice low, controlled. "You left me," Ethan said, his voice rough, from days of exhaustion. "You abandoned me out there?" Henry's face twisted with guilt, his eyes flickering toward the ground. "Ethan, I didn't want to, I swear." But Lucas, true to his nature, wasn't as quick to admit fault. His smirk faltered, but he leaned back, trying to maintain his usual air of indifference. "What do you want us to say, Ethan?" he asked, his voice casual but tinged with defensiveness. "You were half dead. It was either stay there and freeze to death or leave you behind. We made a choice. A choice to save yourselves," Ethan growled, stepping closer. "You didn't even try. You didn't care whether I lived or died." Lucas shrugged, though his expression was tight. "We're not all heroes, Ethan. Some of us just do what we need to do to survive." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, the raw anger coursing through him. He could feel every betrayal, every moment of helplessness in the wilderness, flooding back. But before he could speak again, the door to the cabin opened, and John Reynolds entered, shaking the snow from his coat. He paused when he saw Ethan, his eyes widening in shock. "Ethan," John said, his voice low, "you made it." Ethan turned to face him, his expression hard. "I made it, but not because of you." John's face darkened with guilt. He stepped forward, looking older than Ethan remembered, the weight of leadership clearly hanging heavily on his shoulders. "I made the call to leave you behind," John admitted, his voice steady but filled with regret. I thought you were too far gone. It was a judgment I had to make." "That's the difference between you and me," Ethan said, his voice calm but filled with fire. "You made a judgment. I made a choice to survive." The room was silent, every man watching the confrontation unfold. John stood still, his eyes locked on Ethan, searching for the right words. Finally, he sighed, shaking his head. "I was wrong. I should have done more to save you." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those words. It wasn't enough to erase the pain he had endured, but it was an acknowledgement, a step toward closure. He turned his gaze back to Lucas, who still sat, arms crossed, as if this was all just a minor inconvenience. "You made a choice too," Ethan said to Lucas, his voice low and controlled. "But you didn't just leave me. You took away my chance to fight. You abandoned me, not because you thought I couldn't make it, but because you didn't care enough to try." Lucas opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say a word, Ethan stepped closer, towering over him. "Look at me," Ethan said. "I'm standing here. I survived. You left me for dead, but I'm still here. And that's the difference between you and me. You gave up. I didn't." For the first time, the arrogance slipped from Lucas's face. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Ethan's words. The room was thick with tension, the other men watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Ethan took a step back, his body still tense but his mind clearer than it had been in weeks. He had survived the wilderness, battled through pain, cold, and the crushing weight of betrayal. But standing here now in the warmth of the cabin, he realized something. He didn't need revenge. He had already won. His survival was proof of his strength, proof that he was more than the sum of his injuries or the betrayal he had endured. He glanced back at John, who still stood with guilt etched into his features, and then at Henry, whose face was pale with regret. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the weight of their choices, before turning toward the door. "I didn't come back for revenge," Ethan said quietly, his hand on the door handle. "I came back to show you that you were wrong. You left me to die, but I survived. That's all I need." With that, Ethan pushed open the door and stepped outside into the cold, the crisp air filling his lungs. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked away from the cabin, the echoes of the confrontation still fresh in his mind. But as the wind swept across his face and the forest stretched out before him, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Peace.